So now we're still in Spain. We're not going to get off Spain. We do want to do one more thing, and that is this myth of this Andalusian paradise. It's the cover, actually, it's the title of a book that was written in 2016 by Fernandez Morera, a Cuban-born associate professor at Northwestern University, where he takes this idea that Islam is benign, benevolent, and when it comes into a foreign culture, especially like a European culture like Spain, that it comes in as a benefactor, and the people welcome it with open arms. And their track record is so much better than anything the Christians have done. This has always been, I've always got this in the neck. Adnan Rashid, who is a friend of mine, I've debated him a number of times. He would always use this. In fact, he did his master's thesis. I don't know if he finished it. He was doing his master's thesis on this very area and on this very narrative of a paradise that Islam has brought. And if it's a paradise in Spain, it can be repeated today in the 21st century, is the way they always look at it. So, Thomas, you're going to help us with this because you don't even know who Fernando Morera is. You've not read his book. No. This is a whole different area. You're going to bring it from the German standpoint, from the German scholars, and from your own studies. Tell us what really did happen in Spain. Was there a paradise there? Is this something that Muslims can support and defend, or is there another narrative that we need to know about?
Yeah, exactly. So that's why I thought it's really important to bring this up, because this myth is really still extremely prevalent. And I myself, I always assumed it to be true because you hear it everywhere, by not just by Muslims, but by like anyone. And that's also how I want to start today, because I have a quote which comes from a paper by the UNESCO. And I just want to read this real quick. So this is from a paper called The Routes of al-Andalus, Spiritual Convergence and Intercultural Dialogue. And this is done by this panel of intercultural dialogue of the UNESCO. And they write, so this was just not too long ago, within the last decade or so. They wrote, throughout the period of Islamic rule, al-Andalus was a remarkable example of outstanding model of tolerance. It emerged at the time of the conquest, when the Muslim conquerors undertook to preserve the freedoms of their subjects, protect their fortunes and their property, respect their churches, and ensure their defense. It demonstrates in the clearest possible way the generosity of the conquerors' conduct and policy towards the vanquished in the age of the governors, which resulted in a perfectly harmonious cohabitation and a model of peaceful coexistence between the different races and religions. End quote. Now, anybody with the slightest bit of like understanding of humanity, let's say, will see immediately that this cannot possibly be true. This goes against all human experiences. That like a paradise like this can't even exist, let alone that it did exist in the Middle Ages. Now, what a lot of these proponents of this myth of the Andalusian paradise bring up, and as does this UNESCO paper, are Ibn Rushd and Ibn Maimun, or in the Spanish version, Averroes and Maimonides. These are always the poster children of this tolerant and perfectly open and philosophically inclined al-Andalus. And I would just want to go real quick over those two people. So first we have Ibn Rushd, or Averroes. He lived from 1126 to 1198. He was a physician, a jurist, and philosopher, and he's called father of European rationalism by many. He's famous in the West mostly for his commentary on Aristotle. But the thing is, while his books really were very popular in Christian Europe, they were burned in al-Andalus. And he had to go in exile. His writings were banned. His legacy played no role in the Islamic world whatsoever, let alone in al-Andalus. And his work was only preserved by Jewish and Christian scholars in Europe, because they valued his work. So to bring him as an example of this open culture is really, it proves the opposite. I mean, it proves, yes, there was this guy, he did write an important commentary on Aristotle, which was very, very popular in Europe. But immediately he was ostracized for it. So not a great start. So the second one in our list here, Ibn Maimun. He was a Jewish philosopher, astronomer, and physician. He's one of the foremost rabbinical decisors and philosophers in Jewish history. And again, he had to go in exile. He had to pretend to convert to Islam and was then almost killed for apostasy because the situation in Spain was so bad that he couldn't live there. He then moved to, eventually came to Egypt, where he could live then under or within the Islamic or under Islamic rule, but not in Spain, because Spain was not tolerant enough to tolerate somebody like him. And this persecution of these philosophers was by no means the exception in Muslim Spain. That was the rule. And to underline this, I brought some, again, some quotes. So first of all, while it's true that there was a brief golden era, maybe a few decades under Caliph Yusuf ibn Tashfin at the end of the 11th century, so a very, very brief period, which was actually the time of Averroes and Maimonides. This was a historic outlier, and it did not leave any marks on Andalusian culture. This was, yeah, a few decades max, and then again, then the books were burned, and they were had to leave the country and had to be exiled. Now, the first one was actually tackled this myth that I'm aware of is Ignaz Goldziher. So this myth is actually pretty old, as you can see, because he wrote in 1877 that he wrote a long text called The Spanish Arabs and Islam. And what he does in the text is he distinguishes between Eastern and Western Islam. And he said that in the East, the Abbasids, they were actually patrons of science and started a program to translate Greek scientific texts into Arabic. Whereas in Spain, philosophy was always seen as exotic at best and persecuted at worst. And now I want to quote him real quick. He said, "We are entitled to state that it was the tendency of Eastern Islam in its religious and social institutions to allow the freedom of the mind to prevail beside tradition, whereas the Spanish and Maghribi Arabs, the system, whereas with the Spanish and Maghribi Arabs, the system of religious and social life excluded, at least theoretically, free thinking and allowed no constitutive element beside tradition to prevail or to even exert effective influence." And now I want to again remind people that what we talked about in previous videos, that this Islamic Golden Age in the East, that was mainly a Persian enterprise. And that's what we can see here. That's this sort of this tradition of the East. That was the Persian influence, which was open to scientific endeavors. But further in the West, so in Northern Africa and Spain, this wasn't the case at all. And even other like Muslim historians, they saw it the same way. So I've got another quote here. This is from al-Makari. He lived from 1577 to 1632, and he was a Muslim historian of al-Andalus. And he wrote, "Philosophy is a science hated in Spain, which can be studied only in secrecy, just as works on it can be kept only in secrecy. The Andalusians industriously and successfully pursue all the branches of science, except natural philosophy and astronomy." So basically other branches of science back then, that would have been medicine and mathematics potentially, but I think that's pretty much it, right? So no natural philosophy, no astronomy. No. Although these two disciplines were studiously patronized by the upper classes, the scholars did not dare to expose them overtly for fear of the multitude. Had anyone been reputed to deliver lectures on philosophy or to study astronomy, the multitude would have instantly branded him indelibly as an infidel. He ran the risk of being beaten in the streets and having his house set on fire. Perhaps the Sultan himself, in order to gain popular favor, would have condemned the poor philosopher to death or ordered his book on philosophy to be burned. So that's what the Muslim historian of the 16th and 17th century wrote about al-Andalus. And what we can see there in al-Andalus is that the particularly rigid Maliki school of jurisprudence was dominant, which has a fixation on tradition and law, and has no room for free thought whatsoever. Study of the books of jurisprudence was even more important than the study of the Quran or the Hadith. So, yeah, I mean, there goes this this fantasy of the paradise of al-Andalus. It was the exact opposite. It was a dystopia, if you will, like no room for anything outside of tradition and law. And with that, we come to the end for this presentation. So in summary, what we can say is that looking at the Spanish conquest, the conquest of Spain by Berbers and Arabs started out as Visigoth civil war. The invaders were anti-Trinitarian Christians. The Spanish Christians don't mention any new religion for more than a century. Church sources only mention a rise in anti-Trinitarian beliefs. This anti-Trinitarian Christianity tips over into Islam more suddenly than in the East, and al-Andalus was not the free-thinking utopia, it was rather the opposite.
So just as you've been going through that summary, it's a summary that is material that is new for many of us. We've known about the Andalusian problems with Morera's book that came out in 2016. Goldziher back in the 1920s is much earlier, and it's the German school seemed to know about this before those of us here in the West. Interestingly, Morera is Spanish speaking himself, and that's why he went back to the original Spanish documents, and he went right back and went to the very documents that gave the whole historical context and showed that when the Muslims came to Spain, there was no such thing as benevolence. They actually, in many cases, there's case after case where they had all the people in a town and village go into the church. They would lock the church and then they would burn down the church with everybody inside. And you can see the persecution and just the despotism that went through Andalusia by the Muslims is completely opposite than that UNESCO report that you have. Why? Let me just ask you. I mean, before we get into this whole thing with Andalusia and what this myth that has been perpetuated, you're bringing into context a whole different timeline than what we're used to. You're showing that Islam in the West took much longer. You're proving that if you look and see what was happening on the ground, if you look at letters of the bishops, if you look and see what the writing is that took place in that time by those people, they're giving us a different timeline, a much longer timeline, a much slower timeline of Islam actually being penetrated, and that there was an antecedent of anti-Trinitarianism that was there with the Visigoths, that was there with the Ibadis, bring it over and actually introduce it and influence the Berbers, and then the Umayyads who then take advantage of that and move right in and take over then Spain, because the anti-Trinitarian was already there in place. It made for an easy way to take over the power at that time. But this did not happen at all in the 7th century between 622 and 661 that we've always been taught. This happened right up until 850, up until Rahman II really was the one that introduced it in a big way as an authoritarian environment. So that's a whole different timeline, a whole different context. By looking and seeing that the standard Islamic narrative is hopeless, even on something as important as this. I hope people are realizing that we've got to throw the standard Islamic narrative out. And we've got to do what you've done, Thomas, what the Germans have been doing, and that is going back and reading what the documents on the ground. Ignaz Goldziher did that. And that's why it's important that we go back and see not only what he is saying, but also al-Makari, who is a Muslim himself in the 1500s up to the 1600s. He even was saying that there was a hatred of philosophy in Spain. I don't know why today there is this view of Spain being a paradise. Where do you think this came from? How did it become so strong a narrative?
We can trace this actually rather nicely, but it's it's a long story. So it really starts with let's say the Reformation, because back then Spain was obviously the poster child of Catholicism, and particularly in the Netherlands, which used to belong to Spain, but which then became Protestant. There was a lot of anti-Spanish propaganda because they wanted to be independent, and they used the religion as well. And then this sort of got transferred over to England, where it persisted for a while. So there's always this image among the Protestants in Europe that Spain is this evil country. They have the evil Inquisition and so on. So that was one element. A couple of centuries later, then came the what's called Romanticism period, right? And now these people, they look back at the time before the Reconquista, and they idolized it a little bit. So they looked at it in this romantic way. They looked at those old palaces. And said, oh, this must have been great people. So that sort of was going into the 20th century. And then we had the Spanish Civil War. And there we had the fascists who used this Reconquista language, right? They say, we need to take control of Spain back. So like like in the Reconquista against the Muslims. So now our new enemy are the communists, more or less. And then the left side, they took also this narrative, and they then identified with the Muslims. They said, okay, now these are the new conquistadors, and now we are the new Muslims. So and the left, they were the intellectual elites. They were in the universities already in the 1930s. And this is really, they've just swallowed this. And it's not even that they necessarily fabricated history, but now they have a confirmation bias, right? So they identify with the Muslims against the people who are reconquering Spain. And they can find it in history in those writings from the Dutch and from the British. They can find it in like the stories from the romantic period, and it really has ingrained itself in academia because of it, and it's spread from Spain across the world really. And it's only in recent years that people are remembering again, like this time before the Spanish Civil War, when people like Ignaz Goltz here were more open to actually looking at the real history, and actually look at the evidence on the ground. Because yeah, as I said, I think what we've been seeing is a lot of confirmation bias, people wanting this to be true because they identified like with the struggle of the poor Muslims who were kicked out by these evil Catholic conquerors.
Well, fascinating. So it's really, what you're saying is it's all reactionary.
Yeah, on all sides, like everybody uses history to tell like their story, their mythology, and at some point it's just once people start believing it, then we get these consequences.
Yeah. Well, listen, you've done a great job by going back to the time period, by going back to the events of that time, by going back and putting it into a timeline so we can follow it date by date by date, person by person by person, and showing who are the major players in their context at their time. And that helps us because we've always want to see what history tell us, not what a reactionary group tell us, or what European academics are telling us, or even what Muslims now have taken and are running with. And as a result, it's good to be able to reassess and realize much of the history took much, much longer, did not come. What we've been told that everything that Islam was and became and is still today happened in a 22-year period from 610 to 632. The politicization and everything that happened with the civil wars and all the rest, that happened a little bit more. The entire eradication of Christianity from Northern Africa, that happened within a 40-year period between 622 and 661. What you're hearing now with these episodes that Thomas is giving us, no, it didn't happen after that at all. And to understand it, go back to the 7th century. Just follow what was happening. Look at the letters that are there. The bishops were writing. The coins are there. The artifacts are there. The inscriptions are there. Even the mosques are there. And they're not pointing towards Mecca at all. So there's something else happening here. It's when you start looking at all the artifacts on the ground, Don't listen to the philosophies that are coming out of the narrative that's coming out of the Abbasid period. That's all that we've depended on. Let's look at the rocks. And if we're not going to cry out, the rocks are going to cry out for us. God bless you. Thank you so much, Thomas. This has been a good series of episodes. It's a great way to wake people up. We're going to get some reactions. Certainly the Muslims are going to react to this. They won't like it. So you'll be ready with pen and paper to write your notes down, and we'll probably come back to answer some of the best questions. Please do get your questions down so we can hear them, and also to help you out, because that's what we want to do. Make sure that you see not what happened from what the Abbasids have been telling us. That's the Islam of faith. We want to know the Islam of history. And to understand the Islam of history, you need to go back to the historical record. Thanks so much, Thomas. God bless you. This is Jake.
Thank you.
And Thomas. Over now.